Hey gang, Jake here. We tend to talk a lot about hypotheticals on this channel, and I enjoy that. It's a nice chance to stretch the creative muscles and try to think outside the box to, well, make something that resonates with people. It's been a while since we've gotten the chance to do that though, so today we're going to cover something new. We've seen a lot of crossovers in the last few years. Seriously, it feels like in the wake of Smash Ultimate especially, crossovers are the new hero shooter or quirky Earthbound inspired RPG. It's come up a ton, and while I'm getting a little burnt out, I don't think the concept has lost its potential. No, I think it just needs to expand. Oftentimes when we think of crossovers, it's who would win in a fight, or how could these two take down these two. Everyone likes to see characters throw down, and I'm no different, but there's other ways to make characters meeting enjoyable, and I think Sega had it on the money nearly 15 years ago. What if all your favorite characters got together and they just did something fun? Honestly, it sounds refreshing to me, so let's talk about it. Let's discuss an indie crossover sports game. But first, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to explain why I chose this concept in particular. Admittedly, when this idea first started rolling around in my brain, it was just because I thought seeing Gunvolt play soccer would be funny, but as time went on, I felt more strongly for the concept. This idea has been had since before the last Nintendo Direct, but seeing people's reaction to both Mario Strikers and Wii Sports making a comeback, I'm willing to bet plenty of people would go nuts for this. Lastly, something that resonates with me about the Mario and Sonic games is their original premise. At the time, Sega had just gotten the license to use the Olympics in video games, and they decided that the best way to represent an event that's all about different cultures and athletes coming together would be to squash the, at the time, biggest rivalry in gaming. Sports are a great unifier of the world, but while Mario and Sonic are great for representing that, I think indie characters could go so much further. You see, indie games are developed around the world, and that means that, with a great roster, we could represent nationalities and developers around the world. That idea really excites me, and I want to talk about it. With all that out of the way though, let's get into the game itself. So, with all that fluff said, how would this game even work? I think there's a couple of options for the concept, but only one really speaks to me. Ultimately, I think the best answer is found somewhere you may not expect. Mario Sports Mix on the Wii. Now, we wouldn't be doing too much of what that game did, but we will borrow the basic concept. 4 different sports, with each allowing for 4 different gameplay styles. However, unlike Mario Sports Mix, we'll be using 6 sports that are relatively similar. Don't get me wrong, I love variety as much as the next guy, but for the sake of making the game just slightly easier to develop, we'll roll with games that all use a basic court structure. Now, while I do want to get right into the sports on display, we should probably first outline the basic structure of the game. Each of the chosen games involves a court or field of some kind, which means we'll need movement. That'll be controlled with the left stick, obviously, but what can the player do in this space? Well, they have 4 different options, each of which are assigned to one button on the ABXY area of the controller. First, the dash, which can be used to quickly get into positions or dodge projectiles. Then, the primary sport action. This action varies between the different sports, but it'll generally be a simple volley or a pass. That's followed up with the secondary sport action, which also varies for most games, but there's a little more variety in there. Lastly, there's each character's unique skill. These will pull from a meter each player will have access to, and involve a variety of techniques, from passive buffs that slowly drain meter, to powerful moves that use all of it in one go. As for how gameplay is formatted, essentially each player will choose a team from the roster of indie characters. For most sports it'll be a 5-man team, but for some it'll be less. The player can switch between these characters using the D-pad, and from there, they'll have to strategize and manage their assets to win a match. Now that that's out of the way, let's discuss the sports. First off, we have a worldwide classic on our hands. Soccer is possibly the single most beloved sport in the modern age. It's also the basis for this gameplay scheme, so it's great for demonstrating how it'll work. For this game, the primary sport action will be a standard pass. This is mainly just for getting the ball between characters, and the power of the kick depends on how long you hold the button. The secondary sport action will be to catch the ball, or, if your character's already holding it, to attempt goal kicks. This would give every character the ability to rudimentarily perform the tasks of any position on the field, which means we can keep our controls simple and still feature tons of variety. For the next sport, we've got one that you don't see a lot in the cultural zeitgeist these days. Rugby isn't super present in America, but it is an iconic sport, and one that'd be a lot of fun to see here. It can be kinda difficult to explain, but in layman's terms, think of football without pads. For the primary sport action, we have a tackle. It doesn't cover as much distance as your dash, but it can knock an opponent down temporarily, or stop the play if you tackle the ball carrier. For the secondary sport action, we'll use a grab. This can be used to stop a ball carrier's motion, and they'll have to mash out to carry on. However, there is an exception. If you're currently controlling the ball carrier, you'll have access to passing instead. You can only pass to teammates that are behind you, but it can still be a helpful tool if you're backed into a corner. For the next sport, we'll keep up the single court games with basketball. I'd genuinely be surprised if someone in the audience didn't at least know what basketball is, considering the impact it's had on not just American culture, but the games industry itself. The sport would be largely similar to soccer for our purposes, with some mild differences. While the primary action would still be a pass, and the secondary would be a catch or a shoot, there would be an extra function for our primary. For our primary ability, if the player uses it without the ball, they'd set a screen. This will create an obstacle for the opposing players, and if they dash into it, will cause them to lose the ball. The screen can be exited by dashing. However, if the screen button is pressed again, that player will perform a pack. This is vital for defense, and it's super useful for blocking shots, but it leaves you airborne and the basket vulnerable, so it may not be the best option in every play. As for how shots would work, it's a little complicated. We'll cover this more in the roster, but each character would have an accuracy stat, and this would impact how well they can land shots. Thus, you'd have to be careful and avoid taking risky shots like three-pointers unless you're using characters who excel in accuracy. The closer you are to the basket, the higher your chance of making a shot, and if you perform certain motions with your character, you can perform special shots, like layups, hook shots, and dunks. These wouldn't impact your score, but they would go a long way to making this feel like basketball. The next three sports are different, for a number of reasons. First off, all of these sports involve split courts. Each team is restricted to their side of the court. Second, they involve much smaller teams. For an example, let's talk about the most standard of these sports. Tennis is an iconic game, and one of my favorites on this list because there's already a great indie game that provides a frame of reference for how this could play. If you've never played Spirit Sphere DX, you may want to check it out, because it's a great game, and it's very useful for this concept. For the primary sport action, you'd have a standard volley. This would be a quick parry with a medium amount of power behind it. For the secondary action, we'd have a much stronger strike, which would have quite a bit of speed to it, but take longer to initiate. In Spirit Sphere, this can also be used to curve shots, but I'm okay with it not doing that here for two reasons. A, I want this game to be a little more fast-paced than Spirit Sphere, and B, I don't want to fully copy that gameplay. Up next, we've got a sport that you don't see very often in video games. At least, how it's normally portrayed. Volleyball is a super fun casual sport to play with friends. Overall, it's fairly similar to tennis, but there will be some differences. For instance, the volley would largely serve the same purpose. However, the secondary action wouldn't be a strong volley, it would be a jump. This jump would allow the player to use their volley in the air, as well as block incoming volleys. Thus, the player would have access to both an offensive option with a spike and a defensive option with a block. In addition, unlike tennis where you'd use 2 characters, in volleyball you would use 4. Normally that number is 6, but I wanted something smaller for the sake of screen space. Overall, this is the most basic explanation for how one of these games would work, but that's fine by me because we're going to follow it up with the most unique sport. Dodgeball is possibly the most aggressive sport we're featuring in this game, and likely the hardest to explain. The player would essentially have access to 2 different movesets, depending on whether or not they have a ball. If they don't, they'd have 2 actions. Their primary would be a catch, which would give them access to a ball, and if one of their teammates is out, allow them to rejoin the game. The secondary would be a simple grab, which players would use to pick up balls that have lost their momentum and aren't being held currently. This is a pretty supportive moveset, which makes sense, because with a ball, every option is some form of offense. For instance, the primary skill is the standard throw. This would send the ball flying in your direction of choice, and it would carry plenty of momentum. For the secondary, you'd have a parry though. This is when you block a ball with one you're holding, and while it would be useful, the parry ball would lose momentum, and you couldn't determine its direction, so it wouldn't be optimal to just hold a ball and parry back and forth. Ultimately, this would be the weirdest and most volatile sport in the lineup, and a perfect way to cap the set off. Lastly, before we go, there is one more thing I want to discuss: the roster. Now, this video is already crazy long, so we're not going to go too into detail on this, but I want to outline my thoughts with this character lineup, as well as how characters will work. First, I feel like a roster of 16 is a reasonable starting point for a game like this. That's 16 unique skills, and 16 different models that'd have to work with this game's animation style, but the number feels right to represent a fair number of characters. Also, the goal today isn't just to get the most iconic indie characters. We want some of those, absolutely, but we also want some weird, unexpected picks, and we want to pick characters with a wide variety of global backgrounds, both in-universe and in development. As for how characters work, they'll again have different skills, but they'll also have different stats. There will be 5 categories: speed, strength, defense, agility, and accuracy. They'll all factor into each sport, but I'll give an example of a practical use for each stat. Speed is flat movement, and it's important for a game like soccer where there's a lot of field to cover. Strength is the power behind things like shots and parries, and it determines the arc and momentum of the ball in pretty much every sport. Defense is how sturdy a character is, which is a factor for getting tackled in rugby or setting a screen in basketball. Agility is how light on their feet a character is, and it's important mostly for dodging things with the dash, like avoiding screens or tackles. Lastly, accuracy is the ability to control the ball's arc, and it's important for things like taking shots in basketball. With all that said, let's get into the characters we're choosing. First off, we have Gunvolt, who's a great example of a speed demon. He's got solid speed and accuracy, and great agility, but he's only okay at strength and outright bad at defense. His special ability is to put on his Prevasion necklace, which lets him slip right through his opponents until his meter runs out. Next, we have Mayday from No Straight Roads. She's an aggressive player, so she's got solid speed and strength, but her defense and accuracy are only okay, and her ability is garbage because she commits to every movement, so she's ultimately a high-risk character. Her skill has her wear her Zook mask, which grants her temporary invincibility, accounting for her weak defense and inability to dodge. Madeline from Celeste is our first real all-rounder. She's pretty decent at everything, but excels in strength. Her skill is Battle-In, who lets her dash without having to deal with cooldown frames, which means her coverage is insane, but she can still be blocked by a high defense character. Susie from Deltarune is way more aggressive than even Mayday, but she's not particularly concerned with things like moving or dodging. Her skill is Red Buster, which lets her charge the ball with energy to shoot shots that can't be blocked, only dodged. Jackie from Going Under is another character who's good at most things, but it's easy to throw her off her block, so her defense is her weak point. Her skill is the Java app, which increases her productivity tremendously, but causes her to temporarily crash hard after she's run out. Kick from Dive Kick is just an actual basketball player, which means he's got some of the best accuracy on the court, but struggles to keep up with all the superpowered weirdos he's competing with. His skill is to hype up the crowd, which increases team morale and temporarily buffs his team's accuracy. Yang Yumo is from Dusk Diver, a Musou-styled game developed in Taiwan by JFI Games. She excels in strength, but her speed is less than optimal. Her skill is her magical MMA form, which boosts her strength and defense, but runs out pretty quickly. Wally, the protagonist of Aerial Knights Never Yield, is a runner, and he shows it. His agility and speed are through the roof, but he's not particularly strong or sturdy. For his skill, music from his home game plays, and he enters a flow state where he can seamlessly dodge with no trouble. Juan is the protagonist of Guacamelee, and he's a legacy indie character. As a wrestler, he's very strong and sturdy, but he's also no slouch in terms of speed. For his skill, he can switch the battleground to the land of the dead, which has the impact of switching the opposing team's stats. Think of it like Trick Room, but way worse to deal with. For instance, if you've got, say, a 2 in speed or a 5 in accuracy, suddenly you'll have a 1 in accuracy and a 4 in speed, which means your entire strategy will need readjustment. Shantae is another legacy indie icon, and she's also another all-rounder type character. She excels in agility, though. Her skill is a transformation dance. She'll transform into an elephant, which gives her the highest defense stat in the game, and also causes an intense disruption while everybody struggles to get around her. Next, we have Nocturna from Crypt of the Necrodancer. She may not be the most obvious pick, what with not being the mascot, but personally I way prefer her to the other Necrodancer leads, and honestly that's all the justification I have and need. For her skill, once it's activated, a bar appears on screen indicating the beat of the song, and if she performs an action in sync with this beat, things like dashing, passing, or otherwise, that action is buffed. For instance, she'll kick further, dash quicker, so on and so forth. Then we've got Scott Howell, the second canon athlete on this lineup. We don't actually know what position he plays for the Spooky High football team, but we do know he jogs, which means he's likely a linebacker, so speed and strength are priority. For his skill, he'll call in Polygeist to use their skills as prank masters to rig the game ball. From here, he can pass it to an opponent, and if they catch it, a blast goes off, stunning them and any of their allies in the area. Enzo Coriodan is from Orion, a beat-em-up developed in Central Africa by Kuro O Games. He's also a natural athlete and a capable warrior with high agility and defense. His skill revolves around Orion's magic counter system, which means he can use different elements in different situations. Once he activates the skill, he'll choose between 3 options: fire, ice, and earth. If he chooses fire, he'll fling the ball in a swath of flame, essentially performing Red Buster but with a little less launch. If he chooses ice, he'll throw the ball and create a trail of ice shards behind it, creating a small patch of impassable terrain. If he chooses earth, he'll fling the ball under the court, carrying the ball a significant distance and preventing anyone from intercepting it, but leaving it vulnerable to a steal once it resurfaces. Acrid is a weird beast thing from Risk of Rain 2, which is one of the best roguelikes out there. He's traditionally seen as a melee character, but that's not always the best way to play him, because he's not that strong, but he's great at moving around. For his skill, he'll use Blight, which is definitely not tournament legal. He'll spit a contagion at the nearest opponent, which will leave them tagged and cause them to transfer the disease to nearby opponents. This status effect remains until Acrid's meter runs out, and leaves them with decreased speed while turning Acrid's dash into a tackle that he can use to stun them. Sakuya Izuyoi is a protagonist from the Touhou games, and while she's not the first pick for many Touhou fans, she does have some of the best potential for a skill. Like Gunvolt, she's great at agility, but unlike Gunvolt, she excels more in strength and defense than accuracy and speed. For her skill, she'll use her time stop powers, reducing everyone on field but her to statues. From here, she can go essentially anywhere on the court she wants, but there's one issue. She can't interact with objects like the ball, goals, or other players, until she restarts time. Ultimately, she does much better with setups for big shots than she does with actually doing the dirty work. Lastly, we have Lyn from Spirit Sphere. She's likely the most obscure pick of the litter, but you need some of those obscure picks, and she's a great choice. As far as stats goes, I think it makes sense for her to be another all-rounder, considering that she is the Ryu of Spirit Sphere. For her skill, we'll give her the ability to curve shots once again. Once activated, when Lyn performs an action like a pass or a shot, she'll have the chance to curve the ball to fake out opponents and create openings for herself. Unfortunately, it does leave her physical body defenseless. And there we have it. That's about all I've got for this topic. I could discuss DLC characters and games or extra modes, but honestly this script is already 11 pages and I'm terrified of editing this, so I think we'll leave it here. I want to thank my friend Bellabop Art on Instagram. She handled the special portraits for this video and she did a fantastic job, so please go give her a follow. Also, thank you guys for watching. I know these dream game videos are naturally fairly niche, but they're a fun creative exercise, and I'm glad I get to do them. If you guys enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. Those are my best gauges for how these videos are received. If you didn't enjoy it, or have your own thoughts on a game like this, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'm honestly curious as to how people feel with a concept like this. With all that said, I'm gonna go get to work on next month's videos. Peace out.